the next generation. I'm just going to share a little about the Truth and Reconciliation in my understanding, my experience, and hopefully I'll be able to provide a better understanding, especially for the young people, but more so for the people, our own people, as well as the non-Indigenous people. My mother was in residential school. My mother was an orphan. She was an orphan at 8 years old. And they picked her up and they put her in residential school. And she spent 8 years there. She never came home. She never got to see her relatives. And she never got to experience anything of family connectedness. I just wanted to share that because I wanted to show you a picture of many of our young people, or many of the Indigenous people that have had the same experience. Truth and Reconciliation is about what happened to the Indigenous people of this land. And we're not asking anyone to try to apologize, but we're asking that we change the systems that caused it. That systemic racism, the Indian Act, the Child Welfare Act, all of that, all of those policies. And I'm speaking specifically to the adults here. I will address the children later. But this is specifically for the adults. But the children must understand as well, because you are the future leaders. And you are going to dictate what is going to happen in the future by your intelligence of treating people fair. By the intelligence of understanding that every person has to have equal rights, equal lives, equal opportunities. And I was listening this morning to Marie Sinclair, and the Indigenous people were not treated that way because we were put in residential school. Our children, our parents and our grandparents were put in residential school to erase who we were as Indigenous people. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to come back. As Indigenous people, the Truth and Reconciliation must be that we acknowledge as Indigenous people who we are. If we're Cree, we need to say that. If we're Dene, we need to say that. If we're Blackfoot, we need to say that. If we're Piikani, we need to say that. If we're Nihil, we need to say that. We need to say that for ourselves because that's who we are. The intergenerational trauma that happened with residential school is one of the truths. And the impacts, as Barb was saying, with the elders and the difficulties that they had is part of that impact. I just want to share a personal story of those impacts. My granddaughter committed suicide in 2018. She was in the child welfare system. Her mother committed suicide. Her mother's mother committed suicide. And her mothers, her grandmothers, her great-grandmothers were all struggling with the impact. And that is the sad reality of what we're facing today, the epidemic in suicides on Indigenous people is frightening. What we need to do as people, as human beings, is begin to embrace who we are We need to embrace, especially the Indigenous people, we need to embrace ourselves as Indigenous people. I wanted to share for the young people, each and every one, and I know that you're probably not even aware that the Indigenous people have their own names. The names that you see and the names that you hear, who they are coming from the names that were changed. And I mentioned earlier, my name is Cici Gwanswu, Bravo Woman. As Indigenous people, we each had our own identity and our names. And I want you to acknowledge that. And maybe even do a little more questioning on how did this happen and why did this change and how did this come about. That's how your education will begin, about who we are as Indigenous people. Yourselves, and if you're non-Indigenous, your neighbors, your fellow students, who they are. It's important because the education system right now doesn't acknowledge that. Harper School Division doesn't even acknowledge that this is a day that we must stand together. Instead, they continue to operate. And it's disappointing, and I have to say that. I want you to imagine, especially the adults, what it must be like if you had your children taken away from you at the age of 6. And not able to see them for 10 months. At this time of year, it's very difficult for all of us as Indigenous people. I talk about the intergenerational trauma, and each and every one of us as Indigenous people don't understand or don't know that at this time of the year, we begin to feel anxious. We begin to start getting nervous. Sometimes we, and in my case, start getting annoyed and angry and irritated. I'm overwhelmed with emotion because it's during this time when our families, if they could, would run away and hide the children. And when they couldn't, beg for them not to take the children. And the children experience this and watch their parents cry while they're crying, being pulled away. Imagine that. That's the truth. That's a truth. And many running away during this time because they couldn't handle being in residential school. Either getting hurt, physically, mentally, emotionally, or even dying. Because they ran away, because they got lost, because they got hurt, because they went somewhere they didn't know where they were going, and were never found. So this month, in September, is the month that I always wondered why I felt lost, confused, emotional. And that's what we call the intergenerational trauma. It's in our DNA. It's in my DNA. It's from my mom. It's from her mom. I carry it. I know it now, and I can name it. And then we work from there to fix it for ourselves. You can't fix it for me. I can only fix it for myself. But you need to acknowledge that it's there. That's the truth. You need to acknowledge the intergenerational trauma. That's the truth. And when we see the Indigenous people homeless and on the street, you know it's because they had nowhere to go. you know, it's because they gave up. And they most likely gave up because they didn't know who they were. They didn't know. They didn't even know why they were here. So understand, and if you can just say a prayer for them, because that's all we can do at this point, is say a prayer for them, that they find their purpose, they find their way, and they find their understanding of who they are. I just wanted to share one other thing about culture and how important our culture was and how it was so necessary to ground us. As a teenager, I did not know who I was. I didn't know I was Indigenous. I didn't even know I was Cree. I understood Cree. I didn't even know. My parents spoke Cree, but that was all part of our life. But we didn't have an association about it from ourselves as an individual. And I remember when I got into an argument with my mom, and she got upset with me. And we lived by the river, and I went to the river. And there was a tree there. I went to hug that tree because that was the closest thing that I could feel to connection. And it's in our DNA. And that's another thing that's in our DNA. It's not just a trauma, it's our teachings. That's where our connection is. And so many, many years later, when I went back and started living and practicing and following the traditional ways of my people, sun dancing, sweat lodges, ceremonies, pipe ceremonies, when I went back to do those, at the Sundance, we honor what we call in our language Ugamatik, and it's a center pole. And we touch that center with our prayer one more time. That's the DNA. It brought me there. It gave me that strength. As a teenager, it gave it to me. I didn't know. And as an adult, I knew. And it connected. So we have it as Indigenous people. We have it in our DNA on dealing with that trauma. We live it, and we can deal with that trauma. So I just wanted to share those experiences and the impacts, residentials. I'm educated. I have my degree. I'm a half marathon runner. I run half marathon. These are my marathon shoes, by the way, and this is my half marathon attire. And I carry, but I wear a feather in my hair as opposed to carrying this, but I could carry it now. That's resilience. That's part of our resilience. And I just really wanted to say something about resilience because it's interesting that we have to be resilient. That's interesting because resilience comes with unforeseen events and natural events and events that cause disturbance in your life, and you have to pull yourselves through. What we have to pull ourselves through was not a natural thing. And so our resilience is I think, in my opinion, is a completely different category of resilience. Our people are in a different category of resilience. It's not normal. What we went through was not normal in humanity. But we pulled through it. And I just want to honor every one of you, every one of the survivors that have made it and are here today and live to tell their story. In my opinion, that's resilience in our own way. How? Nanaskum Tanawa Kahio.